Hello all, Old Geek here, and it's time to go way, way back in time to take a look at the first D&D hardback. The first product to bear the AD&D logo, the original Monster Manual. This is the oldest book I have, and one of the few items to survive my great purge when I stupidly dumped all my gaming stuff about 20 years ago. I originally bought it in around 1984 from a school friend, and it still has some of his writing in it, along with additions of my own. Yup, I coloured in a lot of the monsters. Badly. And as I was 13 when I did it, I focused on the female monsters and took great care colouring in certain parts of their anatomies. With that admission out of the way, let's get started. I did wonder back in the day why some of the stats and descriptions in this book felt a little incomplete, and the reason why never dawned on me at the time. The book was originally written in 1977. Mine's a 1978 4th edition version, but it's pretty much identical to the 1977 one. And that was all a year before the Player's Handbook, and 2 years before the Dungeon Master's Guide. And that simple fact would have answered the questions that I had. While it is officially the first AD&D product, it wasn't really, as people who bought it at the time would have been using it to play the original white box edition of the game, and close examination shows evidence that AD&D statistics were indeed used in creating the monsters. The worst armor class of any of the creatures is 9. AD&D goes up to 10. And there are no entries in the book with the 4 alignments that didn't exist back before AD&D. Lawful neutral, neutral good, neutral evil, or chaotic neutral. It's all the extremes with neutral. So that's another indicator. I used to wonder why I had to go to the Dungeon Master's Guide to get experience point values. And that, of course, is because AD&D's experience point awards had yet to be written. It annoyed me at the time, having to bounce between books, but with all the evidence now at hand, it has to be forgivable. It's just got to be. So, with that little bit of history out the way, let's get on to presentation. And yes, the original cover is often subjected to mockery. It's badly drawn, especially that appalling red dragon. It's crude, but it has charm. Plus, of course, it was done in 1977. Internal artwork is by several artists, though most pieces are the work of the 2 Davids, Trampier and Sutherland. Of course, Trampier's images are the ones that stand out and give the book its character, though some of the Sutherland work isn't all that bad. I know I often speak badly of his art, but some of his work in this book it's okay. While Trampier's work is not all up to his usual high standard, there are some in this book that are great, including my own personal favourite piece of black and white fantasy art. It is here in this book. As with a number of the AD&D hardbacks, this book was re-released in 1985 with new cover art, this time by Jeff Easley. And while it is undeniably far more impressive and attractive, I don't know, I'm not sure which I prefer. Yeah, well, be sensible, John. It has to be the Easley artwork, but it doesn't really quite have the charm. It's difficult. The book is fairly slim, just 112 pages, but it packs in a lot of creatures, often 3 or 4 to a page. Descriptions are mostly kept very succinct, There's very little in the way of fluff, usually just a sentence or two on what the creature looks like, then an explanation of abilities and sometimes a few snippets on society and behaviour, though not all the time. Compared to later books, this all feels a little bit sparse, but looking back with experienced eyes, it's fine, because the vast majority of creatures in this book are familiar to us all. And this is the book's great strength, its familiarity. While there are a few made-up creatures, the vast majority are drawn from either the real world, such as apes, big cats, bears, rats, etc., or from myth and legend, vampires, ghouls, trolls, genies, titans, and, of course, dragons. The legends are not just those familiar to people from Europe and the USA either. We have the Coatl from Central America, the Rakshasa from Hindu mythology, and the Kirin from China, along with a number of creatures inspired by literature. The Mind Flayer is so clearly Lovecraftian, as is the Intellect Devourer. The Treant is straight from Tolkien, and so on. Thus, florid descriptions are largely unnecessary. Anyone with even a passing knowledge of Greek myth will know all about harpies, or Medusa, or the Hydra. We've all heard of were-creatures, werewolves, being an iconic horror trope. And then there's giants, and demons, and devils. And thus these names are ones that already conjure up images in our minds and inspire DMs to create adventures in which they are used. That added fluff is really superfluous for so many of them. Gygax's pulp inspiration is in evidence as well in the extensive array of dinosaurs on show. But I am going to be a pedant here, yeah, I've got to be, and point out that pteranodons, plesiosaurs and elasmosaurs were not strictly dinosaurs by definition. Small point, moving on. A few of the creature choices are a little odd, and some have clearly been created as gotchas for the rash parties. Rockgrubs and ear-seekers spring to mind here. But all in all, the variety of creatures in what is physically a pretty thin book is impressive. I always particularly liked the individual monsters, the unique dragons, Bahamut and Tiamat, demon lords such as Demogorgon and Driblex, and archdevils, Asmodeus, Beelzebul and Dispater. Though these individuals would have benefited from a little more in the way of helpful text, particularly in terms of creating their lairs on their planes of existence, because to me it's obvious that character parties should not be encountering them directly, and it would have been very helpful, certainly when I was 13 or 14, to have an idea of how to create a plane of hell and what demons and devils and traps should be there to make the whole encounter with an archdevil so much more dangerous and so much more memorable. The book is filled with snippets of humour, which is always nice to see. Some of the illustrations of creatures breaking the fourth wall have never failed to bring a smile to my old face. The mischievous leprechauns rearranging their nameplate at the top of their page, the chimera setting fire to the border around its image, and the rust monster corroding its own border. These all immediately spring to mind, and it's these little touches that make the book and its artwork so memorable. They help us forget what the book lacks. There are no encounter tables. They would appear later in the Dungeon Master's Guide. There's no suggested level ranges for the creatures in terms of party encounter suitability. Again, that would be in the Dungeon Master's Guide. And there's very little information regarding typical terrain where each creature is to be encountered. Plus, of course, the missing XP awards, which would have been very helpful for a DM creating an adventure. We do, thankfully though, get the treasure type table at the back of the book. So at least there's that. but we would have to wait 2 years to properly put it to use. I do remember wondering about what I saw as consistency errors. I got my first copy of the Dungeon Master's Guide before I got my monster manual, and the tables in the DMG mentioned Mezzo demons and Nika demons, neither of which appear in the monster manual. What I didn't know is that they had appeared in the D series of modules after the monster manual had been published, and they would later reappear in the Fiend Folio. Again, it confused me at the time, but looking back, the game was, of course, in a continual state of development. The Fiend Folio would be the second monster book to be produced by TSR, a weird and wonderful tome filled with bizarre oddities, some of which stuck and have become iconic D&D creatures, many of which dropped off the face of the earth. A little later we got the Monster Manual 2, which was packed mostly with higher level and extra planar foes, and while very interesting to read, is ultimately much less useful than its older brother. And that sums up the Monster Manual for me. It was so useful, so immediate, so direct, and so easy to use. I would also argue that the later 2nd edition Monstrous Manual was probably a better compendium of monsters. It was much more thorough, giving full descriptions including ecology, diet and society of the various creatures. But as with so much from the 2nd edition era, what it gained in functionality, it lost in terms of charm. So, speaking of charm, I mentioned my favourite piece of internal black and white fantasy art, and it's on page 104 of the Monster Manual. Treasure by David Trampier. Apart from maybe the original cover of the Player's Handbook, has any image ever encapsulated the feeling of old school adventuring quite like this one? What's in that chest? What is shining on their faces? Other than gold, there's got to be something more in there. What did they go through to achieve this loot? Are they aware of the skull and the bones lying behind? Are they significant? Is that skull or those bones, do they mean something? More questions than answers, and that is what made Trampier's work so good. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the nostalgia. I've been the Old Geek. Thanks for watching.